Hello, everybody, and welcome to StrategyGuideReviews.com. My name is Blake Grunman, and I'm back with another video review for another strategy guide. This time around, I decided to take a different approach. I was reviewing the guide for Uncharted 4, and I thought, you know what, let's try something outside of what we would normally do. Now, normally we would go to the digital version of it as just kind of an afterthought and kind of mention it in passing. Well, this time around, I decided to focus solely on playing the game with the digital version of the guide. So, as we can see right here, I have Uncharted 4. Now, the one catch with this is I would love to be able to show you guys some of the screenshots and other shenanigans that they have going on here. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that, well, to be quite frank with you, you see we end up with this fun little reflection game that is really not fun for people to try to watch. So I'm going to spare you guys that little bit of insanity. And instead, I just figured I would kind of go through roughshod some of the notes that I had on the guide. Now, again, this is over the span of the entire campaign of the game. So, it was the main goal for me was to try to pick up as many of the collectibles as I could, go through as many of the conversations as I could, and any of the weapons, things like that, using the guide as my 100% my map through the game. Now, the first thing that I wanted to get to right off the bat with this guide is that, holy crap, is it thorough. Now, I mean, at least with the single player campaign. Let me put it that way. We'll loop around to multiplayer in a little bit. But as far as the Uncharted single player campaign goes, it is, quite frankly, it may be one of the most thorough guides I've ever seen. Now, anybody who's ever played an Uncharted game is probably familiar with the fact that you're doing lots of platforming, jumping around, trying to kill enemies at like these weird, bizarre scenarios. And now with the game adding in like this weird harpoon hook thing going on, you can break all laws of physics and just be swinging like Tarzan, shooting an AK-47 at the same time, which is insanity. So this had a lot to try to get your hands around, because not only is it trying to guide you through the platforming, but you also have to deal with enemies as well. Now, I have to say that this guide, it did a fantastic job of trying to keep all those in order. Especially with the climbing maps, because, I mean, as somebody who has played a lot of Uncharted games, my biggest pet peeve was that, yes, there are these weird little white chalky areas that you would see, oh, hey, there's where I'm supposed to grab onto next, or that's the next ledge I'm supposed to get to. But there were scenarios where it would fork, and it would go two different directions. And I was like, okay, so if I follow this one, I end up with a dead end. Then I'll forget that there was another fork way back the other way, and I'm lost, and I get really frustrated. And so I'll try to jump for something I can. I end up falling to my death, and I hear just Sully yelling out, "No!" He looks like a fool. So as part of that, this kind of helps prevent that from happening. Now, one thing I do want to note about the climbing maps are, it looks to me at least, and I'm not an expert on the screenshotting of games, but it looks a lot like some of these were genuine shots that they had been handed by the publisher. Now, that's not always the case, because in some of these screenshots that they're showing, like your map and where you're supposed to be going, you can actually see Nate in the screenshot. So it's like, guys, what's going on there? So maybe they're using the screenshotting feature that came into Uncharted, got patched in. I'm not really sure. However, that was kind of bizarre. But just to kind of give you guys an idea, just imagine zooming back on, maybe 100 feet worth of different platforming, different levels, and you could see the bounces that it would do, and then it would show you where you got to shimmy and then where you got to climb up, and it's got different types of lines for the different actions that you're performing, and then for each movement it's got an annotation to it, and it'd say like 43. You then go to 43 and it tells you exactly what you need to be doing. Like, jump over to the left. You'll notice that this rock will collapse under you, so you need to jump up to number 46. And it kind of breaks through one by one the different ways you get there. And it also would explain if there was a branching path, which way you'd want to take, or also if there was a path two different ways that could get you to the same endpoint, it would tell you which way you would like to choose. Now, along with that, there were combat sequences, where you have combat and platforming at the same time. If it wasn't enough to try to platform through this game, it's sitting here saying, all right, well, here's the positions of where all of your enemies are going to be. Here's where you need to be jumping, climbing, ducking through something, swinging on your vine at one point, and it breaks this down step by step by step. Now, again, this comes down to how you want to play the game. See, for me, I am a run and gun idiot. I'll just run in there, just blowing things away. That's how I play the game. Now, the guide itself was definitely focused more towards the people who play strategically, play stealthy. And that's not really in my DNA. However, I did, for the sake of this example, I decided to play out several of these scenarios exactly the way that it tells me to in the game. And I gotta say, it works out beautifully. Now, and it's not like one of those where as you're playing through it, you're like, oh, well, this doesn't make sense, or where somebody's positioned isn't. It is spot on as far as where everybody's going to be. It'll tell you the different circuits. It'll have a little red dot that'll have an annotation that'll say this guy will take a circuit that will go about 20 feet in one direction, turn around and come back. Or they'll be doing a U to these 3 different spots. And it breaks down every single enemy, their paths that they're following, and kind of your best strategies for trying to traverse that. That was awesome. It's so thorough. Like I'm genuinely surprised at how helpful it was, and 2, how well it managed to kind of spell out something that seemed like it could have otherwise been rather unscripted. Now, that said, one other thing that they did really well, and this is something anybody who's played an Uncharted game knows, that there are puzzles throughout the game. And these are not just like, press 2 to open the door. Like, these are rather complex multi-stage puzzles. Now, if you wanted to kind of take the I hate to put it this way, but if you're going to use the game facts approach, you would sit there and you would be just looking through this going, okay, take this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. Yes. Does that get you to the end point? Yeah, absolutely it does. And to that point, that is successful. However, one thing that this guide does that I was very pleasantly surprised with is, yes, it will give you that walkthrough of here's what you need to do, but it's also explaining why you are doing certain things and how this is pertinent to solving the actual puzzle. So it's not like you're just sitting here going, go to step A, go to step B, go to step C, go to step D. It's breaking down why you are doing everything. And to that point, it also would call out like, all right, if you want to look at a special scenic lookout, at step B, follow this branching path. And it would break these things down as part of the puzzles. And in that respect, I was genuinely pleased with how well they did it, because they could have kind of copped out, but instead they decided to put in the extra time and effort to kind of give you the full narrative approach to it as well. So in that respect, beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Now, one other thing that I found that it did a very good job of is calling out optional conversations. Now, in Uncharted games, traditionally, there's just been a very strict narrative. And occasionally you could walk up to somebody and have like a small conversation, which is very one-sided. Essentially, they're talking at you. Well, in the new Uncharted game, Uncharted 4, they decided to not only, you still have those few scenarios, and those are actually deemed as collectibles in the game. So you essentially are collecting conversations, if that makes sense. But also there is scenarios where you actually have branching dialogue trees. Now, for those of you who you're not familiar with Uncharted, they've never had that before. This is a brand new thing where essentially you get into a scenario and you have 4 potential options. Now, one thing that this guide does is it one of 2 things. One, it highlights how little that your dialogue choices mattered in the game. It wasn't going to really change your experience much at all. Because they literally went through and said, all right, if you chose this option, this is what it would say. And then if you chose this option, this is what it would say. And it literally broke down all of the potential dialogue trees and the potential options that would come out of them. Now, it never affected the outcome of the narrative at all, but it sat there and it really did kind of make it so that you didn't have to play the game 4 times to get the experience that you wanted to. So in that respect, I think it was also a very, very neat option. Now, a couple of things with the collectibles, and this is where things got a little bit on the murky side. So in the main campaign, obviously, if you have a key landmark, it makes it very easy to find certain things. However, one thing that the Uncharted 4 finds itself doing a lot of is that the collectibles are kind of off the beaten path a little bit. So you're sitting there traveling, off to, wherever the hell, off in this weird cave, or, climbing up essentially way away from where the action is. It's literally tucked away somewhere that you really would never look. So in that respect, it makes it a little more difficult to highlight where certain collectibles are. So in that respect, it did have some trouble, especially in the underwater levels where things look very similar. Like there's a dive at, I believe it's the second chapter of the game. So I'm not really spoiling too much, but you're doing undersea diving. And there's one specific collectible where it's saying you need to go find and go along the base of this rock formation. And then when you reach this, climb straight up. I was never able to find any of these points of reference that they're talking to because there wasn't anything defining about it. It was literally just saying, hey, this rock thing right here? Go to the left of it. The problem was it was surrounded by an entire wall of rocks. So it's like, this is completely unhelpful. And it was also that way in the jungle too. Like there were several scenarios where you're sitting there going, where am I going here? And again, this is where if we had more essentially almost like a topographical map of the level, it would be more helpful. Or you could have little call outs. And they did this in a few sections, but there were other areas where it would have probably been more helpful for finding these collectibles. And also the fact that you only have one screenshot, it does make it a little difficult sometimes to pinpoint where exactly something is. That said, using the digital edition, that was the one added advantage. If there was something that didn't look all that clear to me, I can just tap it. It automatically would zoom up in a full screen view, and I could zoom in and zoom out and get as much detail as I needed. They were pretty high res screens, so it was very helpful. Very, very helpful, and I was able to look into it in great detail. Now, one of the things that I did find it rather amusing when I was going through this is it was very obvious that the screenshots that were captured, I don't think it was using final game assets. Like there were a lot of things that were really weird, fuzzy, murky things that didn't quite look like they were completely finished yet. Like structurally they were finished, but like, for example, one of the early stages, Nate is trying to get away from the orphanage that he's living in. And they zoom in on the jean jacket. And up close in the screenshots, it looks like a normal jean jacket. However, in one of the other side shots where he's jumping from ledge to ledge, it just looks like he's wearing just like a blue shirt. I mean, it was probably placeholder assets. But that said, it was still, it wasn't anything that was all that egregious. It was just one of those where I'm like, oh, so I don't think they had final game assets there, which was kind of amusing. Now, the one thing that I will mention, and this is something that it did a great job of, is there are collectible weapons, if there is such a thing. There's one achievement that you can get or trophy that you can get for shooting every gun in the game. And as part of that, there are certain weapons that you can only get if you're playing on the highest difficulty. So it calls that out. Like, hey, if you're playing in this stage and you're trying to get this trophy, you need to play this on the hardest difficulty in order to have somebody attack you that has this gun, because it's the only way for that to happen. Along those same lines, there are also enemies that are specific to a certain difficulty, where it's like, okay, and easy, medium, and normal, this is where the number of enemies will be. But then it would say, oh, hey, in this scenario, there's going to be 2 snipers that are perched at these 2 different locations if you're playing it on whatever the hardest difficulty is. And in that was very helpful, because I was playing it through because this was my second time through at that point. I was playing it through on the highest difficulty because I wanted to get that achievement. And so it was kind of cool to actually see it call those things out, because otherwise, how would you have known that? You wouldn't have known. And so that was actually very, very helpful. Now, one thing that I did not end up very impressed with, and this is where I wanted to loop back around, is the multiplayer portion of the game. Now, for lack of a better way of putting it, this is really bad. It's not very good at all. For example, they would give you, all right, standard loadout advice, like, hey, here are the different weapons that you want to use, and here's the ways that you can use them in combination. They would then give you 3 bullet points that would say, hey, here's a couple of different things. They're generic things that they actually would have sometimes in the loading screens, where they'd have like the little piece of dialogue across the bottom. That's how generic some of these items looked. Now, one thing that it did do really well is there are weapons, and then there are different essentially modifiers that can be applied to the different weapons. And there's several helpful charts that would break down, all right, this weapon can use this modifier cannot. And essentially it was this big graph that essentially broke down everything and what could be applied to what. And that was very helpful, especially if you were trying to progress yourself down one specific path or get proficient with one specific type of weapon. it would kind of give you that straight path of leveling up, and you'd know what weapons, what different additions that you needed to purchase for it in order to be the best with a certain piece of tools, which was nice. Now, this is where things get really bad, is the maps. So it breaks down all of the maps with literally the name of the map in big, bold headings. Then 2 lines of really, really small descriptions. That's it. No screenshots, no breakdowns, no strategies, nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was literally like, oh, this is a scenic level that takes place in Tunisia. You'll be mainly running through a mansion during this level. What? If you're going to have this whole call out section that says in big heading maps, and then you're going to break down the name of every single map, give me something to work with more than 2 sentences. Like that, it was really bad. And you see, this is where doing the online guide really made it interesting, because if you're in a print version, I get it. Maybe you don't have final maps. I can understand that a little bit more. This is digital. You have the ability to go in and update these things. However, that did not happen, and it was very minimal at best, and it was kind of disappointing, because I felt like they had a good opportunity here to give unique content that you wouldn't have otherwise gotten with the print version, and they completely chose to forego that. And that, that's sad. That's sad, because this is a good opportunity for them to kind of establish themselves, and instead it was squandered. Now, I will tell you, there was one other section that I did find kind of fun, and there's an extras section that's kind of a breakaway at the end, and they have a whole section dedicated to speedrunning the game and providing hints for people who are speedrunning it, because there is a specific trophy that is, for being able to speedrun the game and beat it within a certain time with a certain level of completion. And this gives you several very helpful suggestions on how to best speedrun the game. I've never seen that before in a guide, so I thought, that's kind of neat. It's worth mentioning. The one other thing is, at the end of the guide, at least the digital version, they've got, the whole appendices, where essentially it's like, all right, here's every treasure, and here's a brief description of what it is, and here's the trophies, here are the gun collectibles, here are the conversations, and all these different things. Instead of breaking them out piece by piece, it was literally one big chart. Nothing. I mean, you could choose to organize it where, all right, I want to view trophies at the top or something like that, but it was all in one chart still. Like something as simple as formatting would have been very helpful in that respect. Now, again, the ability that you have to sort it, I guess you could kind of chalk that up, but it kind of looks like a disaster. At the same point, it would have been nice, one, to see call outs to the pages where some of these collectibles were, so you could kind of reference back, because the descriptions weren't really all that helpful out of context. So that would have been nice to see as well. And again, you're using the digital edition, so you have the ability to do hyperlinking. Again, these are all things that come up from just doing the digital edition of the game. But overall, I just kind of want to loop back. This was a extremely thorough single player campaign guide. I was beyond impressed with the amount of content that they gave us. It was awesome. It really, really was. Now, unfortunately, they let us down a little bit with the multiplayer side of things, and some of the collectibles left a little bit to be desired. So overall, the Uncharted 4 guide, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Thank you guys very much for listening, and keep it locked to strategyguidereviews.com. Talk to you later.